Okay, let's get into it, right? We're looking at the historical and institutional context of Canadian law. So we're going to be kind of looking at an overview of law, exploring different types of law, identifying primary sources of law, Canadian legal history, etc., etc. Early context for law generally. It's been around for 4,000 years. We had a lot of initial key milestones, right? Hammurabi's Code, which was an early written legal system. Confucius and Muhammad contributed in things like Islamic law and such. We had feudal law, which was a governing system tied to land ownership. That existed for a while, especially in the medieval ages. We had and this is important, the 1215 Magna Carta, or the Great Charter, which was a kind of a feudal act that subjected even the sovereign to the rule of law, limiting the authority of the monarchy by proxy. We will go over that more in topic 1, or we will have, depending on when you watch this. And the 1948 Peace of Westphalia, which established the principle of state sovereignty. Canada's legal history, or early milestones within it, as well as modern developments. Let's look at the early ones first. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 transferred French territories of British rule. The Quebec Act of 1774 that preserved French civil law within British colonial systems. The Constitution Act of 1791. Remember, we have many Constitution Acts, and we'll get into that, but this is the 1791 one. It divided Canada into upper and lower regions, and subsequently the Act of the Union in 1840 merged upper or east and lower or west Canada into the province of Canada. At that point, we still aren't separate from the British, but we were a legal British entity. We had certain sovereignty, but not full sovereignty. Once Confederation began, we started to see, the joining and establishing of other provinces, and that moved us in the right direction. And we'll get into that here with modern developments, right? So just before we move on to modern, again, early developments, we had the Royal Proclamation of 1763, French to British rule. Quebec Act of 74, preserving French law. Constitution Act of 1791, splitting Canada into upper and lower, and the Act of the Union in 1840, merging east and west, or upper and lower, into the province, but we still weren't sovereign completely. We were still a British entity. Now, modern developments, right? These are all very important for today. The British North American Act, or what was amended into the idea of the Constitution Act of 1867. This established the legal framework for Canadian Federation, establishing the Dominion of Canada, and established Canadian federalism. This also established our Westminster parliamentary system and our bicameral legislature following that. It also established judicial review in Canada, even though it was not yet expanded upon, which allowed the courts to limit legislative power. But again, it wasn't really fully elevated until 1982. With, depending on who you ask, the Constitution Act of 82 or the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Again, depending on the exam question. But for this, for the purpose of this lesson, just remember 1982 with the Constitution Act of 1982. That is when judicial review was really elevated, right? Let's move on to the next. The Criminal Code of 1892 that codified criminal laws. The Statute of Westminster of 1931 that declared Canada as a self-governing dominion. We still weren't perfectly sovereign. The UK still had a say in our foreign policy, but we were getting there, and we're getting closer and closer to it. In 1947, legal Canadian citizenship was established, and finally, as we've kind of been leading up to slowly through the British North American Act and the Statute of Westminster specifically, the Constitution Act that I talked about of 1982 patriated the Constitution and introduced the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, making Canada fully sovereign and greatly expanding the use of our judicial system through judicial review, elevating it to its utility and normalcy that we see in today's system. So just to kind of go through those modern developments again, we had the British North American Act of 1867, which kind of established the Dominion of Canada and established federalism, giving us our Westminster parliamentary system and our bicameral legislature, and introducing judicial review, though it was not yet expanded upon. 1892, we saw the Criminal Code. 1931, we saw the Statute of Westminster declaring Canada as a self-governing dominion, even though we still weren't fully sovereign. 1947, legal Canadian citizenship, and finally 1982, patriating the Constitution, introducing the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, making Canada fully sovereign and expanding upon judicial review, which was laid foundationally in the British North American Act. All right. That's going to be really important, probably the most important part of this chapter. Types of Canadian law. Public law, kind of focusing on public collective interest, right? This is where we see things like criminal law, taxation law, both things that we'll get into in later chapters. Private law. This is governing disputes between individuals, right? This is tort law, family law, property law, whatever it may be. Substantive law. This is the area of law governing society. It's the content of the law. Or the substance of it, and procedural law, which is governing the rules of law and the procedures within the legal system. Law on the procedure of law. So again, let's go through that again. Public law, focus on public interest. Private law, focus on dispute between individuals. Substantive law and procedural law kind of work as a pair, where substantive law is law regarding the actual substance of the law, and procedural law is law regarding the execution and the procedure of the law in the legal systems. All right. What are the sources of Canadian law? Number one, we have legislation or statute law. Legislation is created by legislatures. It reflects parliamentary supremacy in Canada, even though parliamentary supremacy isn't the end-all be-all anymore because of judicial review. But again, that's Parliament having the highest say. Statute law is very hard to change. It's very static. And statutory law is the ultimate form of law. What the statutory representees pass can override all other forms of law. We'll kind of get more into that in point 5 when we're talking about more legislation, statutes, and the lawmaking process. Another source of Canadian law, case law or judicial decisions, essentially a large part of judicial review. Case law ensures that laws remain dynamic and responsive. It's important to note that case law develops on top of, though it can't conflict with, statutory law. It's based off of legal decisions and judicial precedent, where the judicial decisions of the higher courts influence the lower courts, kind of like a seniority big brother kind of dynamic there. So statutory law is very rigid. Case law is more dynamic, more flexible, and builds upon it, even though it can't override it. Just to reaffirm judicial precedents, if a higher court makes a decision, all lower courts must follow that. Back to case law for a little bit longer. Case law ensures adaptability through judicial precedent, which makes the system even more dynamic. And judicial decisions are published in several different kinds of reports, like the Canadian Supreme Court Report, Dominion Law Report, Ontario Report, whatever it may be. Subsidiary sources, subsidiary sources, sorry. So those were our principal sources of the law. Now let's get into our subsidiary sources. There's customs, so this is our legal practice rooted in long-standing societal customs and traditions. This is customary law. We don't really use it too much. British customary practices are the thing that's the most influential, and we see that the most, but even then it's not really that common. And books of authority. These are scholarly works considered authoritative, usable in court, whatever it may be. The Supreme Court citation, in the case of R.V. Ippley, cited essentially that scholarly text can be used to aid in the consideration of Indigenous sentencing, right? Kind of considering Indigenous history through scholarly work. Just to go through that again, our sources of Canadian law, we have 2 principal sources and 2 subsidiary sources. Our 2 principal sources are legislation or statute law, very rigid, hard to change, ultimate authority. Case law or judicial decisions, very dynamic, built on top of statutory law. It's kind of there for the purpose of being able to influence lower courts through judicial precedents and be dynamic and changing. And then our subsidiary sources are customs, so customary law, we don't really do much of that, and books of authority, or scholarly work that is usable in court. The branches of government and their roles. We have the legislature, which kind of creates and changes laws, the executive, which executes laws, and the judiciary, which implements laws and dispenses justice through them, through our court system. Will we elaborate on this? No. So we will elaborate on this in future topics, but right now all you really need to know, our legislature. well, legislatively, a lot of different forms of government have legislature, whether or not they're democracies. In Canada, our legislature is a combination of the House of Commons and the Senate. That is, like I referred to earlier, our bicameral legislature. We don't have one single leg of the legislative branch that makes up Parliament. We have two, the House of Commons and the Senate, a higher and lower legislature. Senators are appointed, they aren't elected. That way they're not kind of beholden to any politics, parties, whatever it may be. Yeah, and we have both federal and provincial legislation. Federal is obviously the most important, but provincial serves a purpose too. Yeah, the federal legislature that we have is our parliament. We have provincial parliament, especially like to a sense, but yeah, generally our federal legislation is our parliament. Our executive branch, again, they're the ones that execute laws and policies. This is kind of deciding how laws will be executed within their systems. Kind of more on this, our leadership, or the Prime Minister and his cabinet, is the executive branch, and they work hand in hand with the legislative branch to ensure that law is regarded and executed properly. This kind of hand-in-hand relationship, this fusion of powers that we have, which we'll get into later in a different topic, this is why we vote for a party and legislators who then promote a leader to that party and not a leader in specific, unlike America. The executives are MP or a member of parliament legislative members who are brought into the executive. In the U.S., there's a clear separation of powers between the executive and legislative branch. Here, there's a fusion of powers. Again, this is why we're able to get votes of no confidence in Canada, and the U.S. doesn't have them, right? Yeah, so legislature creating and changing laws. We have two legs of our legislature, the House of Commons and the Senate. That makes up our bicameral legislature. The senators aren't appointed, they're elected for the purpose of unbiased nature. We have both federal and provincial legislation. Our executive branch executing laws. Our Prime Minister and his cabinet make up the executive branch. They work together with the legislative branch to ensure the proper execution of our legal system. Yeah, not really, and that is our fusion of powers. Other than that, not really too much. And then again, judiciary, our judiciary branch implements laws and dispenses justice through them, especially in our court systems. Yeah. Legislation. Yeah, statutes and the lawmaking process. Yeah, statutes or statute law or legislative law. It is the dominant legal framework in Canada, as we had established earlier. It's established by parliamentary processes. It's created by the legislature. It's very rigid, very difficult to change, and again, it's rooted in parliamentary supremacy. So it's rooted in the idea that Parliament is above all. Now we have judicial review for ensuring that there's a higher authority, but again, statutory law is rooted in parliamentary supremacy. Again, like I discussed earlier, we have a bicameral legislature. Our parliament is divided into two houses. Firstly, it's the House of Commons, which is the lower house, and above that there's the Senate, which is the upper house. The Senate naturally has less representatives, with the House of Commons having less. We don't elect them so that they can have an alternative perspective with regards to proposals and be unbiased and immune to electoral processes. Yeah, the Senate acts as a sober second thought. The legislature has to go through 3 readings with both chambers. Yeah. The reading in process for the creation of laws and kind of the execution of our bills go a first reading, which is the introduction of a bill, a second reading, which is a parliamentary debate, a third, not reading, but committee review, which is a detailed examination of the amendments, and then finally a third reading, which is the final Senate review for approval. This is our 4-step legislative process. So again, we have our statute laws rooted in parliamentary supremacy. It's ultimate authority. Very rigid, very difficult to change. We have 2 different houses within our legislative branch, which makes up our bicameral legislature, the House of Commons, which is the lower house, and the Senate, which is the upper house. Yeah, for laws and bills to be passed, they go through 3 readings in a 4-step process. The first reading, which is the introduction, the second reading, which is a debate, a committee review, which is an examination and amending process, and a third reading, which is a final review and push to Senate for approval. Just a side note, sometimes we see horse trading politics in legislative processes where there's kind of a back and forth and a give and take in the lawmaking process, where support for laws are traded in exchange for individuals' agendas, essentially, right? You're trying to get something out of it. This can lead to legislative violence, though, if things don't go well, where legitimate fights break out during the legislative process. So it can be very confrontational, very adversarial, depending on the notion of it. And finally, just one more note on the legislation process. Members of Parliament are formed into different committees and different groups, formed through different, individuals and parties, whatever it may be. You're sectioned off for the purpose of giving specific groups specialized ability and specialized role in reviewing laws in a hyper-specific and specialized fashion. Moving on. Indigenous laws in Canada. Canada, our laws don't really fully integrate Indigenous legal orders. There isn't really space for it. But where it is, it's under federal authority, meaning it's allowed to exist, right? It's not an absolute. In some cases, we see legal separation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous law. In Canada, we don't see that, though. And then just to touch on that, for Indigenous law, we see the Indian Act of 1876, which established federal jurisdiction over Indian reserves, which was fucked up, and it kind of saw the reframing of Indigenous laws into fitting Canadian legal structures, so kind of an elimination of legal identity. That's the key crux of the Indian Act of 1876. We go through a handful of cases here. 1908. Prohibited opium except for medical purposes. It was kind of rooted in racism, as well as the Opium and Drug Act, which made opium and cocaine possession punishable by imprisonment. In 1923, weed was added to that. 1961, we saw the Narcotics Control Act, which saw life imprisonment for trafficking weed, coke, and opium. 1997, we saw the Controlled Drug and Substances Act, which is big. It saw weed as being placed as less severe than coke and opium. 2012, we saw the Safe Streets and Communities Act, which gave imprisonment for growing 5+ weed plants. And finally, in 2017, we had the Cannabis Act, which legalized and regulated cannabis use. That one's important. 2017, Canada saw its legalization of regulated cannabis use. And that is it. A very short topic. Topic 2, the historical and institutional context of Canadian law. Again, we went through some legal history, both early and modern developments. We went through forms of Canadian law, sources of law, and both principal and subsidiary principles. The branches of government, our legislative process and our parliament and our bicameral legislature and the Indigenous law in Canada and such. Have a good day.